I'm Rick Dadarian, and this is Realms of Memory. Most Americans believe that it's too easy to obtain a gun legally. Most favor stricter gun laws. Most Republicans and Democrats support keeping guns out of the hands of people suffering from mental illnesses and raising the age for gun ownership. If there's considerable support for sensible gun reforms, the National Rifle Association, known simply as the NRA, is typically cast as the chief impediment. The NRA is seen as a cash-flush lobby that used its money to finance pro-gun candidates and to defeat much-needed gun control legislation. In reality, the NRA, even during presidential election years, spends most of its money on teaching and communications programs, not lobbying. The true and little understood strength of the NRA is its ability to influence a vibrant and dynamic American gun culture. Through its publications, television shows, conventions, and museums, and its support for gun shows, gun ranges, and gun safety classes, the NRA has forged a powerful connection to American gun owners. Through effective storytelling, often tied to individual and national memories, it shaped a deeply meaningful understanding of gun culture that it can use to mobilize millions of members in support of its causes. The importance of culture, storytelling, and memory in understanding the power and influence of the NRA in this episode of Realms of Memory. Noah Schwartz is an assistant professor of political science at the University of the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. Noah wanted to understand the NRA and American gun culture from the inside, so he went on a 5-year journey. It was a journey that would take him from his home in Canada to gun ranges, gun shows, and the National Firearms Museum in Virginia, to the NRA convention in Indianapolis. Along the way, he took gun safety classes, went to gun ranges, learned to fire a concealed weapon, ran a booth at a gun show, and had conversations with scores of NRA members and gun owners. The result of this journey was his book, On Target: Gun Culture, Storytelling, and the NRA. Noah, welcome to Realms of Memory.
Thank you so much for having me.
I was reading a Pew Research survey this morning, and it was a recent survey that came out over the summertime about how Americans see guns. And the survey pointed out how divided Americans are over guns. On the one hand, pointed out that half of all Americans see gun violence as a major problem, yet they're split almost evenly on whether guns are bad for society, whether they increase safety or not, whether we should protect gun rights or gun ownership. And I think all of this is part of what you describe as this great gun debate. And this is a debate that often focuses on policies, focuses on things like, well, should we ban assault weapons? Should we permit concealed weapons? Should we restrict the age at which people can buy guns? And I think the point of your book is this misses this huge cultural aspect of gun ownership, and that we really can't understand how people's connections to guns or how they understand all these issues if we don't pay attention to culture. So why is culture so significant, and why do you think it's often left out of the discussion?
Yeah, I think culture is something that we don't often include in debates over policy. Because we take, I think, people's positions as granted, and we don't think about why people sort of come to the positions or the decisions that they make, or how their opinion on gun control is formed. And so what my research really looks at is the cultural element of this, where you come from, who you know, who you interact with, and where you spend your free time, your leisure time, can have a huge influence on politics. We know that the biggest predictor of someone's opinion on gun control, research shows this, is whether or not they own a gun. And it's not simply just sort of owning a gun as an object, but it is the gun is sort of a key that allows you access to this world within a world. If you're, I'm a millennial, I grew up reading Harry Potter. And so you have this sort of wizarding world that is parallel to mainstream society. And the gun world is a little bit like that. You have people that are gun owners. Some of them, especially in urban areas, because of the stigma, might not share that they're a gun owner with a lot of people that they know, but they have this sort of rich other world. And maybe it's just that they go once a month or once a week to the gun range by themselves to blow off steam. Maybe they're part of a club. part of one of the shooting sports. Maybe guns are a family tradition of theirs. They grew up hunting, and that's still how they spend their leisure time with family at the hunt camp. But there's sort of this rich world of gun culture that lies underneath, that motivates people's positions in this debate. And I think that political scientists have ignored it for a long time, too much to our detriment.
So the NRA is often at the center of this great gun debate, but even the role of the NRA is typically misunderstood. And often this has to do with the failure to see the connection to culture. So how is the NRA often understood within this great gun debate, and what role does it play in connection to culture?
Yeah, so that was really the heart of my book, On Target, is to get to that cultural influence that the NRA has on the gun debate. I think the NRA is sort of a political boogeyman sometimes. You talked about how people are sort of split 50-50 on gun control in the US. This makes it a very effective wedge issue for politicians, like a lot of the big issues in society today. And we're living in an age of what political scientists call negative partisanship. So people are less motivated in politics by the virtues of their side and more by the vices of the other side. We all want to sort of believe bad things about people that we disagree with. This is why misinformation and disinformation spread so quickly. We're very eager to believe bad things about the other side. So both sides of the political debate have their boogeymen. And the NRA is really one, I think, for Democrats and for the left. They sort of want to imagine that the NRA is more powerful than it is. But in my book, I peer behind the curtain of the NRA. And I think rather than imagining the NRA's influence as entirely related to lobbying, so they're kind of subverting the democratic process with their sort of behind the scenes work, the NRA's strength is really tied to their ability to motivate and mobilize this large community of gun owners towards political action. So if you are a senator or a representative, and you know that there's a big vote on guns coming up, and you receive, 500 calls or 500 letters or a whole bunch of people that show up to your town hall meeting that are very passionate about their guns, that's going to make you fearful about voting for restrictions on gun rights. And in an American political environment where there's so many sort of choke points for legislation to get caught up, that can really stymie change. So I think we have to look at the NRA's influence as being related to their ability to bring to bear, to motivate this culture of people towards politics. Because you have a group of people that are primed to be politically active. We know also from research that gun owners are more likely to be politically active than non-gun owners, especially on the issue of gun control. And this makes sense. If you're a gun owner, you're probably part of a community of gun owners, and you want to defend your community when you perceive it to be threatened by legislation. So yeah, I mean, this cultural element is huge in understanding why the NRA has been so successful, why they have this sort of huge, for lack of a better term, militia of people that they can kind of call up when there's a political threat, who are going to be motivated to do the things that make politics work, write to your elected representative, donate money at the right time in the right place, things like this.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting because you point out that people have this perception that it's the NRA is this just spending all this money, basically buying off people or paying them to take their positions, and that when you look at the dollars it spends, it's actually spending. Even in presidential election years, you point out that it's spending a little bit more money on educational programs, on communication programs, and these are really broad programs that start even at the elementary level, school level. I think you pointed out Eddie the Eagle. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, so I think that's a really important point to emphasize. When we compare the NRA to other lobbies on Capitol Hill, we compare them to big pharma, big oil, right? They are a very lean lobby. They're not spending nearly like fractions of the amount that those other lobbies are spending. And they're getting, if you'll pardon the pun, there's a lot of gun puns in this line of work. They're getting a really good bang for their buck. And the most of their spending is on that service element. And this goes back to the NRA's history as a service group. The NRA was founded in the aftermath of the American Civil War, when the military brass kind of realized that conscripts and recruits were not very good at shooting. Sort of despite America's reputation as a gun culture, the ordinary Americans were not shooting very well. And they looked at Great Britain and they looked at Canada, two countries that had a lot of government funding comparatively for civilian marksmanship programs. And so they wanted to set up their own organization. This is a little known Canadian connection. They actually visited Toronto to ask the Dominion of Canada Rifle Association and the Government of Canada for advice on setting up the NRA. We don't talk about this a lot in Canada. I don't think it's very well known. But so they set up this organization, and it really is, for the most of their history, about promoting marksmanship. And this is a huge part of their mandate today. So they educate over 1 million Americans every year in gun safety. So they teach courses, like introduction to pistol, introduction to rifle, shotgun, concealed carry courses, even women's self-defense courses. They're not called women's self-defense, but they're sort of marketed in a way that it's understood that they're women's self-defense classes. And they do have, like you said, the Eddie the Eagle program, which is about teaching kids about gun safety. So what to do, if you find your parents' gun lying around in the house, don't touch it, go get an adult. All of these things that, once again, to people outside of the gun culture, seem very strange, but within the gun culture, it's perfectly normal. If you're going to have guns in the house, it's your responsibility to educate the people around you on how to interact with them safely. If you're going to use a gun, it's your responsibility to learn how to do so in a safe and responsible manner.
So if you're trying to understand why the majority of Americans feel like the right to bear arms should be protected, the right of individuals, that there is a broad effort that goes way beyond just gun ranges and National Rifle Association meetings. That really goes right into the school system too. There's messaging that goes out there that affects perceptions of guns even at an early age. But I think you point out that when it comes to the real effectiveness of the NRA, so it's putting most of its energy and resources into educational programs, into different forms of communication, that it's able to convey certain messages, certain stories, and it's able to tie them into ideas. It's able to tie them into American history or ideas about American identity, and people end up internalizing these ideas, and without ever really having any idea where they came from, or not necessarily even understanding that these are ideas that are fairly new. And again, I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and they were talking about you might think Southern culture in the U.S. is really steeped in gun culture, but if you look back to an earlier time, 19th century. Maybe even up to a fairly late date, that the idea of concealed carry was opposed in the South. It was seen as something that was unmasculine. So the ideas about weapons they're culturally constructed, and those things can change over time. So people have certain associations today that wasn't necessarily inevitable. So, and I think you talk about these stories that are told through these different NRA communications resources in terms of macro narratives, right? And there are a handful of these macro narratives. So what are these stories that are told? There are only a few of them that you see coming up in lots of different places in your book.
Yeah, this is a really important point. I think we have a tendency to read back the present into the past. We imagine that the way things are today are the way they have been for a long time. And we don't necessarily, relive these histories. And I think the story of concealed carry is really important. In most states, it was very rare to have concealed carry up until this big revolution in the 1980s, where suddenly more and more states started adopting policies that would allow people to conceal carry and loosening restrictions on what you need to be able to do that. Culminating, of course, in the permitless carry or constitutional carry movement that we see today, sweeping a lot of states. We're just sort of removing all restrictions in terms of taking a course, getting a license for concealed carry. And this is definitely related. This imagining of the way things are is related to the stories that we tell about the past. And I think, once again, to go back to this cultural influence of the NRA, their ability to tell stories to this culture is one of the key ways that they unite people and bring it together, and also shape the way Americans see their own history and their own past. So the three central macro narratives that the NRA likes to tell. The first one, obviously, is that guns have played a unique role in America's history. So we see this a lot told through stories, not just of the American Revolution, and the idea that firearms were not only integral to the breakout of the revolution, right? We have some of the first battles are over the British attempt to confiscate gunpowder from the colonists. But also it was the ability of ordinary people to own guns, which allowed them to be involved in the militias and rise up against Britain. And then you have obviously stories of the Old West and people, using guns to bring justice to the frontier. You have stories about World War II and brave Americans using guns to fight for the freedom in Europe. So there's this sort of idea of firearms as core to American history and what it means to be American. You have this idea of guns being tied to the broader cause of freedom. You often see, interestingly enough, the NRA telling stories that sometimes have nothing to do with America, but it's tied to this idea of people using firearms to fight for freedom. And then, of course, the big narrative I think that everybody's going to be familiar with is the story of the good guy with a gun, which has been broadened to be, also the story of the good gal with a gun nowadays. So this is oft repeated, and it's tied back once again to the mythology of the Old West, the Lone Ranger, the lone sheriff, bringing justice with his 6-shooter. And that narrative can then be tied into more recent events, like the stories of people who have stopped mass shootings, right? The good guy with a gun that intervenes at the opportune moment to stop a mass shooter. The person who defends their home from dangerous intruders with a firearm. So these then macro narratives become very personal through these stories, because I think we can all imagine ourselves in a situation where we might be threatened, and we can empathize with the characters in those narratives.
I think your point too is that you're not inventing the past. For these macro narratives to work, they've got to tie in with existing stories, and you're just kind of finding ways to weave guns into that. So there may be an understanding of the American Revolution, but then there's this insertion. Well, did you know that this is also a little known aspect of this, and that might tie into this idea of what role guns have played in American history.
It's about emphasis. You place the emphasis on certain elements of the past, and that impacts the moral of the story, right? If we place, we know with any history, especially when we think about conflict or something conflictual, right? Right now with the war in the Middle East, the way that you tell that story and the way that you put emphasis is going to impact the message that your reader or your listener takes from that story, and that all stories in some sense are intrinsically political, and there are political elements to this that we either consciously or unconsciously bring to life when we tell these stories.
And because this culture, with this messaging, with these stories, is place specific, you get this particular American understanding of guns that gets wrapped up in their own history. And you mentioned, well, Canada has an important gun culture as well, and there are millions of gun owners and a long gun tradition in Canada, but they see gun ownership in a very different way. They haven't had the same messaging. They haven't had similar stories. So, what's the difference? How do they perceive guns in a totally different way?
Yeah, this is a really important comparative case, right? Because Canada, we are, neighbors in the United States. We share a lot of cultural similarities. Canadians consume almost entirely American media. We're both former British colonies. And there's this assumption that America has a gun culture because of the revolution, and Canada didn't have a revolution, so we don't have a gun culture. And once again, there's some truth to that story, but it didn't just happen that way. That story has to be told. That story has to be brought into the present by people. And there were choices that were made along the way that led to this divergence. A lot of people don't know, until the 1970s, Canada's gun laws were not very strict. You didn't need a license to own a rifle. Canadians could own fully automatic weapons, and there were, collectors that would collect military machine guns and things like this. And then in the 70s, as America is starting to go in this direction of loosening gun laws, Canada goes down this rabbit hole of tightening gun laws to the point where now we have very strict licensing systems. The current government has brought in all of these new, freeze on handgun sales, ban on what they call assault style weapons. So there's sort of two common strands that diverge at this point. But once again, you could just as easily tell a story of guns being important in Canadian historical memory and the fight for freedom. There's a very famous Canadian, Louis Riel. He was a Métis Canadian in the West, and he resisted the incursion of settlers in Manitoba in Western Canada using largely Winchester rifles. Right. So that story can be told in Canada, but we just don't have a powerful actor that's telling it. And I think that contributes a lot to this mythology in the United States. But once again, as you mentioned, you need this infrastructure of commemoration. It can't just be the NRA telling this story. It has to rhyme with the other stories that are being told about American politics and about, I think, that culture of revolution in the U.S.
So much of your work centered on embedding yourself within the gun culture. Right, and doing this ethnographic work of going to the National Rifle Association annual meeting and going to gun shows, going to gun ranges, actually signing up and taking those courses and getting an inside look at how that messaging worked within those contexts, about how people were internalizing that, or how people's connections to that culture. But before you did that, you note that you were actually doing the traditional work of looking at primary source material and interpreting this material and actually running it through some analysis software that you used to try to make sense out of these historically related themes that might come up, or how guns were framed within these sources. And you looked at the NRA's TV station that it used to have, and you looked at a magazine called the American Rifleman. And you mentioned the American Rifleman has a pretty significant circulation, almost as much as Sports Illustrated. So if you're looking at these TV shows and scores of articles, how do you see these macro narratives, these stories appearing within the content of these communication resources?
Yeah. So to answer your question, I want to go back a bit, because I think, so one of the reasons On Target is it's an academic book, but I think it has a wider appeal beyond academia. And because of that, I think the reason that is because it's fundamentally the story of a road trip. It's a story of a journey, like any good book, right? The Lord of the Rings, it's the story of a journey. So when I'm starting off my journey as a graduate student, a dual citizen, but American Canadian, but I've lived in Canada most of my life, in Ottawa, and I'm thinking I'm going to go out and I'm going to get to the core of American gun culture and the NRA's role within it. I need a window into that culture before I go. Because I've seen a lot of people who have studied gun culture. I've read a lot of people who have studied gun culture who don't fundamentally understand it. They have an outsider's perspective, and they don't sort of look inside before going in to study it. And as a result, they miss things, right? Anthropologists who pioneered this technique of ethnography talk about the importance of getting the insider's perspective in order to understand the culture and thus the politics. So to do that, I wanted to start off looking at the NRA's communication material. As you mentioned, the NRA has a really vast communications infrastructure that is unique amongst advocacy groups, amongst lobby groups. We don't, the big pharma, they might put out a commercial every once in a while, but they don't have, millions of viewers tuning in to their online TV clips. They don't have a magazine with a broad readership that the NRA does, and this makes it really unique as a advocacy group. So I wanted to unpack that first. And as you mentioned, these are really good ways for the NRA to once again emphasize these macro narratives that come up again and again in order to shape this view of American history. So for example, in the magazine, American Rifleman magazine, the magazine is sort of roughly divided between political messaging at the beginning. So there'll be a message from the executive director. This is what we need to be mobilized on this month for gun rights. But a lot of it has nothing to do with the politics of it. It's about the history of guns. It's about the people's personal stories, right? They have readers, that submit their stories about their personal memories with guns. And some of these are quite personal and quite deep and really tied into core themes like family and friendship that resonate even beyond the gun culture. And so I found this really interesting as a tool to build this culture from within. Because people with guns, Dan Baum is an American author. He's a journalist, and he writes about, he wrote a book, The Gun Guys, which I read in the lead up to this, about him, like another outsider getting into this world of guns. And he talks about how, like any hobby, it sort of like starts to leak out into other parts of your life. So you're interested in guns, but it's not just, you talk about needing it to defend your family. It's not just about that. You want to read about it in stories. You want to watch movies with guns. You want to play games with guns, video games. Sorry, I shouldn't say not, or participate in shooting sports. And this magazine, that's how they draw people in. Gun people want to read stories about guns. But once again, when you're telling these stories about guns, emphasizing a certain moral reinforces these political ideas. So if you have stories about heroes in World War II using firearms to defend their friends in their country, right? This is a narrative. This is a moral that's going to resonate with readers. If you are telling stories, as I said, some stories, there was a story about a young man who bought his first gun with his mom when he was a kid. It was an army surplus German Luger that was probably captured during World War II. And, he took this out to the back lot and went target shooting with his mom, and his mom hit a bullseye on her first try. And he talks about this, like his mom has since passed on, but this is a really core memory of their time together. And to me, that primed me to say, like, we really can't be dismissive of this. And this is something I think that in debates over gun control, the progressive side, the Democratic side misses. They sometimes, revert to infantilizing gun owners, talking about guns as compensation for masculinity or for, other things that people compensate for. And there have even been academic studies on this. There are some fantastic study names about ideas sort of debunking this myth that gun owners are compensating. When really guns are important to people because they're tied to culture and family and friendship, because they are objects that allow people to participate in this other world. And so, if we want to talk about restrictions on guns in a way that builds broader buy-in, I think you have to recognize that. And you have to recognize what they mean to people. And unless your goal is to build negative partisanship and to campaign off of that, in which case, that's a totally different kettle of fish in political strategy.
Yeah, and I think the main emphasis, one of the main points of your book, and this was something that I hadn't really expected when I started reading it, is to build empathy, that we have this idea of if you're somebody who is a supporter of gun control, if you're concerned about gun violence, that you may tend to look at people in the pro-gun camp in an adversarial way, and you may tend to think that there's something wrong, or why can't they understand the damaging effects, or why can't they understand how at odds the U.S. is with the rest of the world, and there's got to be something wrong. And you point out that, well, the vast majority of gun owners are law-abiding citizens, and they're not out there committing crime. They have legitimate concerns, and they're engaged in lots of meaningful activities. And if they're reading these magazines and they're seeing these connections to the past, that's only going to strengthen their convictions about the importance, the significance, the meaningfulness of guns.
Yeah, the metaphor that I've stolen from David Yamane, who is a much better scholar than me, and I'd highly recommend people check out his work, is alcohol, if you want to think about it in a certain way. If you're someone, who enjoys a drink on a Friday night, a beer at a barbecue, we can think about the social cost of alcohol and the cost in lives, not just with, drunk driving when people misuse alcohol, but in terms of the public health cost, things like this. And so if a politician were suggesting that more limits should be placed around alcohol consumption, and maybe we should ban hard liquor and spirits because it's too hard. Which I know these are things that Americans have done in the past, right? This might be something that raises your ire, because you would say, well, I'm a responsible user of alcohol. I don't drink and drive. I don't overconsume. So why should I be punished for the actions of people who are going to misuse it? Who even if we ban it, they'll make their own in small batches or moonshine or things like this. So that's the metaphor I often use to kind of try to put yourself in the view of the gun owning community.
Okay. So you had a chance to actually participate in this universe, this gun culture universe, and you have chapters. You have two chapters really devoted to the National Rifle Association meeting, and the first one is, I think, more about everything that's going on within that meeting, all the different activities, and even some aspects that really caught me by surprise, the outreach efforts, right? Because you tend to see gun culture as a conservative, maybe insensitive to the needs of other groups outside of maybe white conservatives. But actually, there's a lot of really progressive things happening within it. The ways they address the disabled, outreach efforts towards women and minorities. So there's a lot that you're discovering when you're going around taking this whole convention in, and then also all of the ways in which people are connected through their own deep leisure interests. So that was just I love discovering that idea of what does deep leisure mean. So could you talk a little bit about how this environment of the just how the scale of this national and this annual convention of the National Rifle Association, the scale of it, its outreach efforts, and all that you saw that conveyed how people are tied into and connected to this to gun culture in really significant, meaningful, deep leisure ways.
Yeah. So I mentioned this is the story of a road trip, right? So I've done the background work. I've immersed myself in the gun culture as thoroughly as I can in a digital and print environment, and now I need to go and talk to people. So I leave my comfortable office in Ottawa, and I'm driving. My first stop is Indianapolis, because that's where the NRA annual meeting is being held. They have a meeting every year. And the way I describe it, the best illusion I have, and I think this speaks to my very serious nerd identity, but if there's other nerds out there, you'll understand. It's like Comic-Con for gun owners. Or if you've ever been to a big convention or a sports show, a golf show, something like that, right? There's a couple of aspects to this. The first is the sort of overtly political aspect. So next to the Indianapolis Convention Center is Lucas Oil Stadium, where the Indianapolis Colts play. This is an NFL football team. And, a big part of the convention are these political speeches. This draws a huge crowd, right? This is 2019. Donald Trump is still incredibly popular amongst his base, his sort of cadre of voters. And a big draw to get people to come is the fact that Donald Trump is going to be speaking. Not just Donald Trump, Mike Pence, several prominent Republicans, and of course, NRA leaders. So you have this NFL football stadium sort of bisected by a curtain, and half the stadium is filled with NRA supporters who have gathered to listen to hours and hours of these speeches. Hitting on, once again, a lot of the NRA's talking points. I think it speaks to the power of the organization, how many advocacy groups get the president and vice president to come to their annual meeting to speak. But it also speaks to how important the gun culture is to the Republican Party and vice versa. Like, this is a really core component of their base, and they recognize that they have to keep these people happy if they want to be able to get them out to vote. So there's the overtly political component, but for me, the more interesting part was the cultural component to it, just because of the lens through which I'm looking at the NRA in this book. The other part of it is a massive gun show. For those who have never been, right, a gun show is a gathering of gun owners. Often there's a lot of vendors there who are showcasing new products. They're selling things. This is anything from people that we would expect to see. Remington, Colt, Glock, the big players in the gun industry are there, to people selling like a panoply of accessories, a gun safe that's 2 times as tall as a person, people selling hunting trips, people selling gun cleaning equipment, stuff like this, accessories. They say, there's a joke within the gun culture that, the gun is the price of admission. The real cost is accessories and ammunition. And people get very, very into accessorizing with this. There's even clothing manufacturers that are making clothes designed to make it easier for you to conceal carry a gun. So this convention center, it's as big as several football fields. There's tens of thousands of people packed into this room, and they're all there and they're all excited about their hobby. And so I found that kind of frenetic energy, that the sort of passion that you see, really helps to explain how the NRA is able to galvanize these people to get political, to get active, to concentrate that energy towards achieving political goals. You mentioned also about the increasing efforts of the NRA to diversify. Once again, I think the NRA realizes that America is changing demographically, and that they need to reach out to new groups if gun culture is going to survive. And they've made real efforts to do so, attracting sort of a more diverse set of spokespeople. At the time, you had Colion Noir, who was a YouTuber and lawyer, gun rights activist, who they had brought into the fold to reach out to the African-American community. You had people like Dana Lash, conservative, once again, big person in the conservative media space, who was doing segments on NRA TV. She was there. There were like gun celebrities. So prominent YouTubers, a lot of the ways that people interact with the gun culture when you can't go out shooting for whatever reason is you watch videos on YouTube, especially young gun owners. So these gun tubers are kind of like celebrities in the gun world. And then you have real life celebrities like Chuck Norris, right? Someone who's sort of a household name, but is very big in the broader conservative movement, and certainly with guns, given that he was an action star. So, Chuck Norris is there. He's as a representative for Glock, signing hats and stuff like that. So yeah, this convention is huge. They're reaching out to different groups and really trying to energize people who are passionate. They're there because they're passionate about guns. How do we get them involved in the political side of things? And once again, a material sort of part of that is, in order to attend the convention, you need to be an NRA member. So they're selling memberships at the door. Once again, come in. If you want to see this gun show, the second biggest gun show in the United States, you got to buy a membership.
So you mentioned a big part, and this is really the primary reason it seems that most people are going to the convention is for the show, is to interact with people that share a common passion, to be around people with a similar outlook, to see the latest gadgets that are out there, to rub shoulders with celebrities, to enjoy all that show has to offer. But there's also a political part to it. And there are these speeches that are given. There are individuals that come out and tell stories. And this is the more maybe overt messaging. And you stress that this messaging is really crafted in very careful ways to resonate powerfully with people, that there are certain aspects or elements to the ways in which these stories are told. So could you talk about some of the speeches that are given, some of the stories that are told, and some of the aspects, common shared aspects that make them resonate with people?
Yeah. So I mentioned at the convention, there are these political speeches, and one of them was given by then President Donald Trump. And his speech was punctuated by 3 guests that appeared. And these guests were obviously hand-selected by the NRA, and they are telling their stories. These are the incarnation of the good guy and the good gal with a gun. These are people who have intervened in order to stop a crime or someone breaking into their house. And once again, they're chosen to target certain key demographics. So you have a woman who gets up first, and she tells the story. She's a mother. Her husband, I believe, was a police officer, so he was often out of the house at night. And there was a break-in at their house, and she was alone with her kids and confronted the intruder with a gun and stopped that home invasion in progress. So once again, this is a story that people can imagine themselves in. They can connect with it. Either men are imagining their wives home alone, or their girlfriends or partners. Women are imagining themselves in that scenario, and once again, a very impactful narrative that's going to resonate with a broad core of the membership. And then they had two guys that had stopped mass shootings. One was a small business owner who worked at, if I'm remembering correctly, a meatpacking factory, and a former employee showed up, and a disgruntled former employee, and had started to attack people at the meatpacking plant. He had his AR-15 in his car. He ran out to his car, grabbed it, and killed the attacker. And then the last person was certainly the most famous, Stephen Williford. There was that very famous shooting in Texas at the church, and he confronted the shooter once again with his own AR-15 from home, and then that shooter eventually took their own life. So these were the personification of the good guy with the gun. And this is, when you're hearing them stand there and tell their stories, it's incredibly impactful, right? You're talking about, it makes this abstract idea of, the overwhelming majority of gun owners are never going to touch their gun in self-defense. If they do, it's going to be they'll pull it out, but an even smaller minority will ever fire their gun in self-defense. And an even smaller minority than that will ever shoot someone in self-defense. It's a small percentage, right? Often, a gun is a deterrent, and you draw it and the situation ends. So to have people who have lived through this, it really enforces it in people's mind that, like, okay, there's a reason that I'm carrying this gun. This could actually happen, right? When you hear someone in front of you telling a story, people don't understand odds and statistics very well, but we understand human situations, right? We understand hearing a story about a person who's lived through this. And there's a great quote by former Lieutenant Mr. Cooper, Lieutenant Cooper, who talks about, it doesn't matter what happens in 1 out of 20 cases. What matters is what happens to me. It's about individual dignity. And I think that these narratives kind of drove that home for the audience. Everyone could imagine themselves in that situation. And once again, there's a political element to that, right? This is something that we need to defend ourselves.
Yeah, so you stress the ability to relate to a story, the emotional effect of a story, pulling on your heartstrings. These are all elements that they're not there just haphazardly. they're in these stories, and they're part of the success of the NRA, and really winning hearts and minds. And you really can't understand the strength of that community, its ability to mobilize people, if you aren't recognizing all the different levels on which it connects with people. And another level, you point out, are gun ranges. And you took a number of classes, and you stress that we need to understand gun ranges almost like community centers. That there's a lot more going on. It's not just people shooting at targets. So how do we need to understand gun ranges more broadly?
Yeah, I think that metaphor of a community center, I think, is really astute. They are community centers. There are places where people organize events. If it's a public range, they'll have a board that's in charge of running it. So these are places where, once again, people are connected socially through these spaces. And then they'll offer these firearm safety classes because, in many states, you don't need any kind of training or permit to purchase a gun. You just need sort of a federal background check. And so you have people that buy guns, and if you don't have a family member to teach you, you've got no idea what to do. So these classes, they offer an important public service. If Americans have decided through the legislative process that they are going to be an armed society, it's important to have people that provide training so that people are using it responsibly. As a point of comparison, in Canada, if you want to get a firearms license, you have to take a course that's run by the RCMP, which is sort of Canada's FBI. It's our federal police force. And they were sort of similar to these NRA classes in that they're trying to teach gun safety. Personally, I actually found the NRA's classes way more useful, which was surprising in terms of they talk about a lot of the nitty gritty about cleaning, keeping your gun clean, about storage, and a lot of them were I was surprised by. And I shouldn't have been, but once again, this is coming from outside the gun culture in. I was surprised by the extent to which the NRA really emphasizes responsibility within that, and that it's the gun owner's responsibility to store their firearm locked up in a safe. Right? You don't think this is something that you'd hear from the NRA from the outside, and these classes also had a profound social component. Every one of these classes sort of goes the same way. In the morning, there's a theoretical component. You take a theory test at the end of the morning, and then you go to the range with the instructor for a practical component. So you actually have to shoot, and you have to get a certain score to pass the class. And then you're certified as having this. And if you do enough of these classes, you can become certified as an NRA instructor and sort of do this as a business or a side business. And at the beginning of the day, anyone who's been in school, first day of the semester, right? Everybody's sitting there, nobody's talking to each other. Or maybe if you came with someone, you're talking to them. But by the end of the day, everybody is best friends because there's something chemical and social about the experience of going through the class together, and especially that shooting component, right? There's a lot of brain chemicals that are activated when you're shooting with regards to, adrenaline, with regards to dopamine, things like that are once again, hard to explain if you've never shot a gun. And so by the end of the day, everybody's clapping for each other, you're patting each other on the back, and you have this social bond that's formed amongst people that were strangers beforehand, which once again, you can't get that unless you go inside the gun culture and experience it. So these gun ranges are community centers, and this is really useful for the pro-gun movement, because if you are if you're an advocacy group and you're trying to mobilize people to write their member of their representative or something like that. And you have a mailing list of gun ranges that you can send out, and you know that those ranges will forward that to their membership. That's hugely powerful. You're not just sort of putting out a social media post and hoping that people see it, and then hoping that, out of the thousands of people that see it, one will do something. You have a direct line to reach people who are primed and motivated to take action. And that's a huge advantage for the pro-gun movement.
But when you were taking these classes, and when you're going to gun shows, and you actually had a chance to set up a booth at one of these gun shows, you had the opportunity to ask people, well, what do guns mean to you? People filling out surveys, people that you had conversations with, and there were certain ideas that kept coming up. So what did you find when people, you had a chance to get a sense of how people understood guns and their meaning?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, and this came out too when I was doing interviews with gun owners as well, there's a very strong connection, this idea linking guns to freedom. Almost every single person, when you ask what guns mean to you, freedom and liberty were two of the first things. So there is this really strong connection in American culture, and I think the NRA has played a big role in reinforcing this, that, America is unique amongst democracies because they have such a widespread gun ownership. And this is a key part of defending American freedom. Participants would mention, during World War II, I think there's quotes from Japanese generals saying that, we wouldn't want to invade the United States because there'd be a rifle behind every blade of grass, right? This idea that the government is kept in check through an armed populace, kind of going back to this liberal British tradition, actually, of British liberalism and that political philosophy. So that came out a lot. But then once again, also those sort of cultural and family connections. So I set up a booth at a gun show in Lynchburg in Virginia. So this is a small community. It's home to Liberty University, which is like a sort of right-wing evangelical school that was set up by Jerry Falwell. This is a very religious community, and a very, a community that's kind of centered around family values. And this certainly came out. You would see, once again, speaking of images that are very shocking, if you're not familiar with the gun culture, you would see people walking around with their strollers, and they'd have kind of obviously unloaded rifles sort of perched up on the back of the stroller. because, they're here to buy and sell rifles, and you got to carry them somehow. But it's very strange for a Canadian to see a stroller with rifles balanced on it, right? But once again, there's that family component. This is something you grew up going to gun shows with your dad. And this came out in the survey and in interviews as well. Some of the people that I talked to that I made friends with doing this research. One of them, he was a pilot. He's away from home a lot. He doesn't see his son as often as he wants. His son's now in Alaska doing university. And when they do get together, they go to the range together. And that's their father. That's how they carve out sort of father and son time. And they were really excited when I saw them. I went to the range first with the father. And then he was like, okay, but you have to go at 1 because my son's going to come. We just got this new AR-15 and we really want to shoot it together. Right. So this was something that this is like a father-son moment in a way that, once again, if you're outside of the gun culture, that's just completely unintelligible and sounds terrifying. But 1 in 20 Americans own AR-15s. For a large swath of the population, this is a normal everyday object that they use for recreation. I interviewed a woman, I call her Susan in the book. All of the names that I use are obviously pseudonyms to protect my participant's identity. She was shooting with her dad. So when we went out to the range together, she brought her dad's handgun. And you could see that this was a big way for her to sort of stay connected with his memory. And she was otherwise someone who probably would be a centrist or a liberal. She was pro-choice. She was very, very excited. Very passionate about women's rights and stuff like that. But through this family connection to guns, she felt very connected to the Second Amendment and that part of her heritage. So yeah, there were these deep social connections once again that came out, but also this broader mythology with regards to American history, this idea that firearms equal freedom.
Okay. So you had a chance to travel to the NRA's main museum, right? And it's a museum that draws several 100,000 people every day, and it really puts this past on display in a way that ties into some of these macro narratives that you talked about already. So how does it do this? How does the museum convey these stories that come up in other places in the American Rifle magazine, in the annual convention? How does the museum do this?
Yeah, the museum is super powerful. The museum is actually what started my interest in this project in the first place. When I started my PhD, my intention was to look at the politics of history in relations between China and Japan. And I was studying Mandarin at the time, and I quickly realized that you can't do a PhD and learn Mandarin at the same time. If you can, you're a much smarter person than me, and I applaud you. So I'm sort of looking around for topics. I'm interested in the politics of memory and the politics of history. And there had been some sort of gun-related event in the United States, and I'm on the NRA's website, and I noticed that they have not 1, but 3 museums across the country. And I'm like, why does a lobby group have a museum? And that's the question that launched the project. So I was really excited. I was able to visit the museum several times throughout my field work there, my summer in Virginia. And the museum, and I was able to interview the editor and speak with a lot of people that worked there. The curator, not the editor. And I really got the impression the museum is intended to once again tell that story of America's past through the prism of firearms. So it starts from sort of the early history of gunpowder and firearms, but it quickly sort of transitions into America's story. So the Revolution, this is the role that guns played in the Revolution. The Civil War, this is the role that guns played in the Civil War. And once again, tying them to freedom, because the Civil War is obviously, for a right-wing organization, that's a political minefield if you're stepping into that history. But what they focus on, especially given the location in Virginia, is Harper's Ferry and John Brown's pre-Civil War attempt to storm the armory there, to arm the enslaved people to start an uprising. Right. So once again, weaving that story of firearms and freedom. They talk about the American West. Once again, in the modern context, with discussions about Indigenous rights and the historical treatment of Native Americans, this is a potentially thorny subject. But they talk about guns not just in the hands of cowboys, but also in the hands of Indigenous people. And they mention that at the Battle of the Bighorn, there were a lot of Indigenous people using Winchester repeating rifles, right? So getting back to that core narrative of firearms tied to freedom, and it's not the gun, it's sort of who's holding it. There's a section on guns in popular culture. So they have a huge collection of guns from movies. But for me, from the perspective of someone interested in the politics of memory, the most powerful part of this museum is an exhibit on the American childhood. And this idea that guns are integral to an ordinary American childhood. So they have this display, which is a child's bedroom. And if you were probably a boy growing up in the 60s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, this would be very familiar to you. If you're a millennial like me, think Andy's bedroom from Toy Story, right? It's got, pictures of cowboys all over the place. There's a Red Ryder BB gun, right, that Ralphie really wanted for Christmas in A Christmas Story on the wall. There are, Boy Scouts of America stuff, because back, I think even in the U.S. there is still some shooting with Boy Scouts, shooting training in Boy Scouts. There certainly was a lot more during the period that this display is depicting. But once again, tying this idea that a normal American childhood involves guns as a rite of passage. You start off with a BB gun when you're a kid. You move up to a .22 when you're maybe a teenager or a preteen in a rural area, and then at some point you get your first real gun, and you are initiated into the gun culture.
You mentioned at the end of your book that the NRA, these are difficult times. There are lawsuits, there are internal divisions with the NRA, and for some people, they might look at this as an opportunity for reform if they see the NRA as a major obstacle, an impediment to gun reform. That, well, if it's only removed from the scene, if it implodes for whatever reasons, that maybe this might open the door. And you have some misgivings about that. You point out that it's not that straightforward, that we could actually go in a more radical direction. So if you remove the NRA from the scene tomorrow, I mean, how might things change? And maybe change for the worse?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best anecdote to illustrate this is the NRA is probably as weak as it's been in years, given these internal legal battles that they're fighting. Wayne LaPierre, who has led the organization, for context, my entire lifetime, right? He's been there for a long time, has finally been forced to step down. Really, they're in a weak spot organizationally, and yet you have the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate for the major progressive party in the United States, both feeling the need to emphasize the fact that they are gun owners very prominently in their campaign. You have Harris during the debate saying, "I'm a gun owner." You have her going on Oprah and saying, "I'm a gun owner, and if someone comes into my house, I would shoot them." Right? So once again, if we see the NRA as a boogeyman and the sole obstacle to gun reform in the United States, we're missing the story of the people behind it that do the work and do the organization, that are not going to disappear. We are missing the fact that they're the most powerful actor in the pro-gun movement, but they're not the only actor. There are a lot of gun groups, and there are a lot of gun groups that are much more radical, as you said. Because the NRA is so large, when a group becomes large and institutionalized, they are forced to compromise. We saw this, for example, when former President Trump banned bump stocks, this accessory that lets you use a semi-automatic firearm kind of like a fully automatic firearm. And we can fight over the technicalities of that. There's a lot of debates over that. But President Trump bans this after the Las Vegas shooting, and the NRA kind of sort of steps aside and doesn't interfere with that. And this pissed off a lot of some of the more involved gun owners, some of the more people who we might describe as a bit more radical, and some of the groups that are a bit more radical. So once again, if we take away this large institutionalized actor that has incentives to compromise sometimes, who takes their place? Who leads the community after this? That's an important question that we want to maybe think about, and that I think once again, maybe cast a shadow over the prospects for that a lot of people, are hoping for gun reform.
Noah, thank you so much for taking time to talk with me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Noah Schwartz is an assistant professor of political science at the University of the Fraser Valley in British Columbia. I've been talking with him today about his book, On Target, Gun Culture, Storytelling, and the NRA. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes of Realms of Memory, tell a friend or family member. The best endorsement is word of mouth. I'm Rick Dadarian. See you soon.